Assalamu alaikum. I'm Dr. Asim Kareem and you're watching my YouTube channel Think Deep. This lecture is a critical introduction of Pakistani English fiction. I'll discuss issues related to language in Pakistani fiction, diaspora factors, themes, points of dual identity of the author, and nationalism in Pakistani diaspora writings. The purpose is to introduce some compelling issues in reading and interpreting Pakistani English fiction. Let's proceed to the discussion. This is my outline. I will talk about the correlation between English language, literature, and the empire. I will also talk about where does Pakistani English literature, especially fiction, stand in the context of debates on language and empire. Then I will talk about diaspora factor, how this factor has contributed to developing creativity in the authors. Then I will focus on themes, some prominent themes in Pakistani diaspora fiction. And finally, I will talk about the connection between the diaspora status of the author and nationalism. The empire and English language were mutually dependent. English became a potent vehicle for supporting the colonizing mission of power, difference, and subjugation. The spread of English language further led to the proliferation of English literature in the subcontinent, with the same intent of establishing and maintaining colonial stereotypes. Hence, political power gradually consolidated through academic and official English language and literature protocols. The same has continued in the former colonies. As Marin argues, we may have lost an empire, but we have gained a lingua franca. First, R.K. Gupta argues that the spread of English in India led to the heavily literary boys in the English was taught even at the undergraduate level. R.K. Gupta identifies three concerns in the spread of English language in India, which have implications for appraising Pakistani English fiction as well. So let's have a brief overview of R.K. Gupta's critique of the spread of English language in India. English classics and the burden of reading them. Most of the time, as Gupta argues, the texts were literary classics that required a high level of English skills. Many undergrads did not know enough about language to understand Shakespeare and Coleridge, let alone be able to give a critical response to them. Then there was not much organized effort to make English language, rhetoric, and writing courses available to the readers, especially the locals. Consequently, detailed paraphrasing became the main strategy in the classroom. And students had to memorize things that they did not really understand well enough to do well on tests. The second issue, as Gupta argues, was that the study and teaching of English in India was conducted with little reference to the student's cultural background. Therefore, the contrast between the culture in a classroom and the outside can be imagined. It was huge and contradictory. Moreover, though the students were from normal Asian society, they were required to read classics of English literature in class. Again, the burden of reading and performing well all fell on the shoulder of the people of the local society. The third issue, as Gupta argues, was the most serious. Teaching English in India was meant to educate students with the knowledge and abilities to understand their nation's past and to explain the West's history to their people. In that situation, teaching English paved the way for establishment of Western knowledge in the local academic community or local culture. Thus, the English language was taught as a means of implementing structures of power. Two most important arguments against English in India, especially in the post-colonial period. First, English was taken as a symbol of the worst part of colonialism and a way to keep people intellectually and culturally slaved, and it slowed the growth of Indian languages. Secondly, people believe that competence in English makes a considerable difference in their career prospect. So we find a kind of paradoxical situation. On the one hand, English was hated because it was a sign of enslavement, intellectual and cultural slavery, and on the other hand, it was a sign of better prospect in jobs and career. With the expansion of British imperialism, English literature was introduced to the locals on a large scale. The purpose was certainly to impart sense of excellence of the Western literary knowledge arisen to the local. Then there was an increase in literature published in English by non-English authors or local writers. As Talib contends, the globalization of English language literature was utilized to support British imperialism in the past, becoming yet another type of imperialism. Talib also uses the God of Small Thing by Roy as an example of the imposition of English as the literary language. Read this slide very carefully. It contains very important analysis of the use of English language by Arundhati Roy in her award-winning novel *The God of Small Thing*. So the relationship between the empire to English literature of non-English English writer cannot be wholly seen optimistically. According to Roy, being forced to identify with a conqueror, especially with a departed conqueror, is like being the child of a raped mother. So this statement speaks of a radical position of using English, but in a way which hurt you deeply, and because it reminds you of the conqueror who has departed but left behind legacy, the legacy of English language. It describes how English language Pakistani literature should be evaluated. The use of English as a language of expression, which is based on a history of repressive and exploitative colonialism, hinders attempts to divorce narrative from everything colonialism represents. In addition, it undermines attempts to establish an authentic post-colonial identity that values the individual above the colonial. On the other hand, using English fosters linguistic colonialism, which continues to mold us in the post-colonial times. Reader's Corner. This slide is for reader to reflect and respond. How do you see Pakistani English literature in the context? Is the English language in contemporary Pakistani literature an emblem of the continuation of the empire? Is it a sign of the privileged status of English in our culture? Does it support the way Roy identified with the language of the departed conqueror? And what possible development in the use of English language do you perceive in contemporary Pakistani English literature? Diaspora factor. Diaspora factor is another way of reading Pakistani English fiction or literature. We know that the vast majority of Pakistani writers are members of the South Asian diaspora in the West. Therefore, the language issue in Pakistani English literature and other thematic concerns should be studied in combination with the author's diaspora situation. Diaspora status means that writing in a foreign language is an expression of our author's dual identity and a desire to reach out to a global audience. In this way, we are part of the diaspora writing that dives into the globalized world of transnationalism and hybrid identities. This position helps them represent migrants and displaced communities from the previous colonies by concentrating on narratives about people's uniqueness, racial and ethnic belongingness, cultural diversities, and global connectivity. Dual identity of being a diaspora gives the writer from Pakistan the power to explore representational challenges and issues like assimilation, acculturation, marginalization, and dislocation. It gives them power and ability to explore home and belonging as a sign of establishing a connection with the home and the host culture. It gives them ability to assess gender, politics, generational conflict, race, class, and cross-cultural communications or connections. See Shamsi's home fire, Aslam's the map of lost lover, and Naqvi's homeboy, among others. It is also necessary to situate Pakistani diaspora literature within the broader domains of South Asian literature in order to draw similarities about various literary issues. For example, the issue of religion and how it shapes or is shaped by these texts must be studied in conjunction with the treatment in South Asian texts. Generally, South Asian migrants create diaspora that are not uniform. This means that the boundaries between Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and Sikhs are fluid, situational, context-specific, and permeable. They interpenetrate and cross-cut one another depending on whether the analytic lens is directed to religious, national, linguistic, or regional divisions. Another key area where the creative response of the South Asian diaspora should be mirrored is related to nationalism and nationalist concern with the motherland. Nationalism, as we know, is not a new phenomenon. People have been attached to their native soil, their tradition, and established territorial legitimacies throughout history. But it wasn't until the end of the 18th century that nationalism became a widely recognized sentiment, molding public and private life and one of the modern history's most significant single determining factors. Fundamentally, nationalism is a political philosophy founded on the concept that a personal loyalty and devotion to the nation-state triumph over all other individual or group interests. It also symbolizes a condition of political and intellectual engagement with the land, space, border, history, and culture in the face of massive colonialism and its narrative of civilizing the primitive. In the post-colonial context, nationalism is a severely contested domain. Colonialism, as Chatterjee elaborated, was founded on two strands. The first was a pre-invasion political state of disorder, lawlessness, and arbitrary dictatorship in the region-like subcontinent. And the second was more intellectual in that it used colonialism as an ideological justification for Indian people's degenerate and barbarous social tradition, which were sanctioned by their religious heritage. Thus, colonization saw itself as conducting a civilizing mission, in addition to the goal of building orderly, legal, and rational governing process. Nationalism in that case denotes a struggle for identity and resistance to the British Raj. The issue that has to be examined is how nationalism is connected to the process of identity formation of the writer from South Asian or Pakistani diaspora. It is also essential to examine the ways in which writers from South Asian diaspora, especially Pakistan, have added to or contributed to the nationalist reaction to the post-colonial continuation of colonial history. The central theoretical concern or area of my critical debate in this lecture is to see where Pakistani writers practice re-Orientalist discourse and where they are taking the burden of independent representation. Re-Orientalism, as Lisa Lu defines, looks at how contemporary Oriental authors of today comment on, challenge, change, but occasionally also reinforce some of these Orientalism practices and with which strategies.